Hello guys, and welcome to another video. Now in this one I'm going to be covering even more of the new ascendancies coming in the Path of Exile 1 event, the Legacy of Phrecia. And last night we actually got another 4 ascendancies, so at this point I'm a little bit behind, but we won't worry about that just yet. So in this video I'm going to be covering the Herald, which is a witch ascendancy, and then also 2 ascendancies from the Duelist, the Paladin and the Aristocrat. So let's get straight into it with the Herald. So the Herald is an ascendancy which is completely focused around Herald skills, of course, given away there in the name. And it's quite an interesting ascendancy actually. It kind of enables a bunch of builds focused around Heralds. So you'll notice the interesting layout of this ascendancy. You actually have to path through 2 nodes to get to the rest, and that means that you basically have 2 mandatory nodes, 2 things that you have to take on this ascendancy. And the first node there is Coming Calamity, which disables your aura skills. So your aura skills are disabled, 200% increased mana reservation efficiency of Herald skills. So let's first discuss that first line. Your aura skills are disabled, because that's pretty obvious what it means, but in some cases there are actually some skills that you may not think are auras, but they're not technically auras, but they do have an aura tag, and that means that they do get disabled. So we actually go through this list of reservation skills here. You've got all of the obvious auras like, anger and discipline and things like that. But you may not be aware of some of the non-obvious auras. Things like Summon Skitterbots has an aura tag, for example. That's because the minions actually apply an aura-like effect around them. And then you also have things like Flesh and Stone, which also has the aura tag. So both of those skills will be disabled by this node. However, there are still quite a lot of options you have open to you. Things like, for example, Arctic Armor is a very strong skill. That doesn't have an aura tag. You can still use that. You can use Tempest Shield, that does not have an aura tag either. And then you could also use any of the aspect skills, those things don't have an aura tag. You can use Temporal Rift, for example. So there's quite a lot of things that you can still actually utilize, even though you have this strong downside on you of not being able to use auras. And of course, because you have such a huge amount of increased mana reservation efficiency for Herald skills, it means that you can just use a bunch of Herald skills as well. But we will discuss in a moment why you may not want to do that. So, pathing through Coming Calamity, you then have to take one of these 5 choice options here, because you must also path through this node. So you can only choose to take one of these, so choose wisely. So we have Future Guilt, which is the Herald of Purity one here. Herald of Purity has a 100% increased buff effect and 15% additional PDR while affected by Herald of Purity. That is really strong. This is possibly the strongest of the 5 here, because 15% PDR is such a strong upside there. And the 100% buff effect there is very powerful if you're playing a physical damage build. Herald of Purity there on a level 20 gem grants 12% more physical damage. So you're going to be increasing that up to 24% more physical damage, whilst you actually have this 100% increased buff effect here. So that's really strong. And then we have Future Fear there, which is Herald of Ice, has a 100% increased buff effect and plus 5% to maximum cold res while affected by Herald of Ice. This one is okay. I think that Herald of Ice is actually possibly the weakest option in terms of going into a Herald on this ascendancy, and I'll discuss that in a minute why I think that's the case, because the other ones kind of have a lot more going for them. Then we have Future Anguish, which is the Herald of Ash buff effect there, and also plus 5 to maximum fire resistance. This is actually really strong as well, because Herald of Ash is quite a strong buff to scale up. It grants 20% of Fizz as extra fire as the buff effect, which will be boosted up to 40% with this 100% increase. So that's quite powerful, and you can actually scale that a lot more, which we'll discuss in just a moment. You also have Future Regret there, which is the Herald of Thunder option. And Herald of Thunder, whilst the buff is actually kind of mediocre there in terms of the amount of damage, the extra damage that it provides you, similar to Herald of Ice, the actual skill itself is going to be quite a powerful option on this ascendancy, as you can spec into it even more up here and make it into like a main damage skill. So I think Herald of Thunder has quite a lot of potential. And then there's Future Nostalgia, which is the Herald of Agony setup there. That's 100% increased buff effect and 75% chaos resistance. That is really, really strong there. You can basically take this, and then if you're actually going for a Herald of Agony build, you can use those synthesized rings there, which give you Herald of Agony benefits, and those also can provide chaos resistance whilst affected by Herald of Agony. So you can pretty much immediately solve capping out your chaos resistance with this and a few of those rings. So you must pick one of those, and then once you're actually at this node, you can then branch out and go into some of these other things. So let's first discuss this branch up here. Retribution will provide 20% chance to gain elemental conflux for 4 seconds when you kill an enemy. This is probably the weakest notable on this tree, but it is going to be quite a nice option if you just want to create a map blaster, someone that just runs through maps and just destroys maps. Elemental Conflux is a buff which makes all of your damage inflict elemental ailments while it's up. So when this buff is actually active, all of your damage will inflict shock, chill, and ignite. You don't need any kind of chance to inflict those ailments, you don't need to crit. Just all of the damage, all of the hit damage will inflict those ailments. So it is a strong buff to have, but you only gain the buff from killing an enemy. I actually wish there was a second modifier on here, which even if it was a small percentage chance, like 5% chance, to gain this buff when you hit a rare or unique enemy, but that's not on there, so this one, more of a map blasting thing, not so much as a bosser. Then we have Damnation up here, which borrows 2 modifiers from Eternal Damnation. Gain additional elemental damage reduction equal to half of your chaos resistance. That's a very, very powerful modifier. And then maximum endurance, frenzy, and power charges is 0, which is a very nasty downside. So the gain additional elemental damage reduction equal to half your chaos resistance is extremely powerful because on Eternal Damnation, not only does it use your amulet slot, and then you can no longer use a different amulet, but you also gain -5 to all maximum resistances from that amulet, and that kind of downside doesn't exist here on this node. So Damnation is immediately quite a strong option there along with Future Nostalgia because you're going to be able to spec into both of those nodes and you already kind of have Chaos Resistance solved. You can focus on the rest of your resistances and it's very, very strong defensively against elemental damage. Now, on the other side of the Ascendancy, we have 2 options which each lead to the same node here. So first of all, we have Persecution, which is +5% to critical strike chance of Herald skills, and Herald skills have 50% increased area of effect. So this one jumps out to me as something that's specifically very powerful for Herald of Thunder. Being able to add a base critical strike chance to Herald of Thunder is incredibly powerful. It already doesn't have any kind of base critical strike chance on its own. So as soon as you actually apply that 5% there, you can immediately be able to start scaling the crit up and possibly get that quite high. This is the option that you're going to take if you want to do a Herald of Thunder Autobomber, and you're going to be able to, go straight into Herald of Thunder, and you're going to want to make use of Storm Secret Rings so that you can actually create the Herald of Thunder Storm just from shocking an enemy rather than having to kill a shocked enemy. And that's going to immediately mean that you're going to be able to make a Herald of Thunder Autobomber that can also do bossing, doesn't need to require things being killed. So that's going to be quite a strong option there. Of course, after Persecution, you can then spec into Apocalypse, which is +3 to the level of all Herald skill gems, and that is extremely strong on Herald of Thunder. You're going to be gaining a lot of damage from those extra 3 skill gem levels. You can actually see that here, the lightning damage on Herald of Thunder at level 20, about 1100 top end, and scaling up to 23, 1500 top end, so a huge damage increase from those 3 gem levels. One thing that you might want to try and look for in this build is lucky damage if you can get that, as that will benefit a lot on those hits. Now, on the other side of this branch here, the other option that you can take to get to Apocalypse, we have the Scourge notable, which is +2 to maximum number of Sentinels of Purity and +25 to maximum Virulence. Minions deal 66% increased damage while you're affected by a Herald. A nice bit of bonus damage there as well. The Sentinels of Purity there are pretty good, but the really strong option here is Herald of Agony. 25 Virulence is actually insane. I cannot stress how powerful that is. Herald of Agony has a base maximum of 40, and you gain another 5 from the quality stat. So 25 is absurd. You actually only gain 5 maximum virulence from medium cluster jewels. That's the pure agony notable here. And someone over on Reddit, Whitworth123, actually did the maths here, and this is exactly what's going on here. So this is the DPS numbers for the Herald of Agony Crawler. That's the Tail Spike attack. And this is a level 20 gem here with no kind of links or anything like that. This is just the base damage. So at 40 stacks of Virulence, the Crawler deals 10,000 damage. At 45 stacks, which is just with quality, it's 14,000 damage. And then 70 stacks, which would be with this extra node coming in, with the Scourge node coming in, the level 20 crawler plus the 5% quality there, it would be 49,000 damage. So you can see how much that is scaling up there. That is absurd amounts of scaling. And then, of course, you can also gain an extra 10 from 2 medium cluster jewels there with the Pure Agony. You could actually even push this to 90 if you're using 4 medium clusters. But this is just kind of ridiculous scaling here from Virulence. When I'm looking at this Ascendancy, there's kind of 3 different avenues that you could go down in terms of, how to scale it. And one of them is Herald of Agony, the other is Herald of Thunder, and the third one is probably Herald of Ash. And in all 3 of those options there, I think that the way that you want to do this is actually not to go into other Herald skills, but to only focus on one. And when you're going to be doing that, you want to spec into Calamitous Visions. This is a jewel that provides the Lone Messenger Keystone, and this one grants 50% more effect of Herald buffs on you, which is particularly powerful for Herald of Ash. Let's discuss that first. So Herald of Ash with the 20% of Fizz as extra fire, that's going to be buffed up to 40% by the 100% increase there on the first node. And then with the 50% more, that's going to go up to 60%. That is without any kind of scaling on the passive tree. There's actually more buff effects there. And not only that, but you can get these Circle of Anguish rings, where you gain up to 60% increased buff effect on top. So every time you kind of get more and more increased buff effect, for example, let's say you're using 2 of these rings with an average of 50% each. That would be 200% total increased buff effect, which would bring Herald of Ash up to 60% of Fizz as extra fire. And then with Calamitous Visions, Lone Messenger Keystone there factored in, that would be 90% Fizz as extra fire. So that is extremely powerful in terms of a buff that you have there. And that's also still not including any buff effect coming in from the passive tree or from cluster jewels, because you can get more of it on there as well. And that's going to start to be an extremely powerful buff. And you could think of doing things like Reap, for example, with that, or Bladeful, Blade Blast, or Blade Vortex. Any of those kind of Fizz spells are going to be very, very strong with this buff. Now, as I said, the other option there is Herald of Agony, and Herald of Agony basically just gains 25% more damage from this. And we already discussed how powerful Herald of Agony is in terms of just how much raw base damage is going to be dealing with those extra virulent stacks. And this is just really, really strong here. And lastly, as we were discussing, Herald of Thunder. Well, Calamitous Visions makes Herald of Thunder deal 100% more damage with hits. So this is basically just a double damage multiplier there. That is extremely powerful. And there's just a lot of potential there, I think, for that Herald of Thunder Autobomber, scaling crit and scaling gem levels. But if you do go for Apocalypse, of course, one thing to note there is that you cannot then go for Damnation as well. So it's kind of an interesting ascendancy in terms of balance. If you go for Apocalypse, you basically are very, very glass cannon-y. But those 3 gem levels are just so much damage on some of those Herald skills. Now moving on to the Paladin, which is a Duelist ascendancy, not a Templar ascendancy. That took some people off guard there. So this one's very themed around auras and things like that. So first of all, we have the Warcry node up here, Bring the Battle. So enemies taunted by you take 20% increased damage, and enemies taunted by you deal 20% less damage with hits and ailments to other targets. And then Warcries have infinite power. It means that whenever you use a Warcry and you actually taunt enemies, whilst they're taunted, they're going to be taking 20% increased damage from you, and you also gain that big buff there from the Warcry itself. Warcries are just really, really powerful overall. You have things like Infernal Cry there, which gains 5% of physical as extra fire per 5 power, and of course it's going to be at infinite power all the time, so it's always going to be gaining that maximum of 25% fizz as extra fire. You also have things like Intimidating Cry, which is a big movement speed buff there. It also makes your next 2 attacks there deal double damage. You have Seismic Cry, which is a huge amount of area effects for slams, and the buff there is more armor. That's pretty strong. There's just a lot of really, really strong war cries there that you can utilize with this Ascendancy. And that's a standalone node there. You can take that right from the start. Then we have Light of Divinity, which is nearby enemies take 25% increased damage. So you can actually stack this up with Bring the Battle, and that's going to make enemies take 45% increased elemental damage when they're taunted, which is quite a strong option to have there. Remember, these do stack additively on the same layer. They both make the target take increased damage. So pretty straightforward node there. Nothing really going on with it. It's just a very strong option if you're dealing elemental damage. And then we have Elemental Valiance there, which is a node taken straight off of the Guardian. So this is exactly the same as it appears on the Guardian. 25% chance to trigger level 20 Summon Elemental Relic when you or a nearby ally kill an enemy or hit a rare or unique enemy. So you can summon this against rare and unique enemies. Importantly, that means that it can be used for bossing. And Elemental Relics are actually really powerful. So this is the minion that the Guardian gets, and there are 3 different types. There's a Fire Relic, a Cold Relic, and a Lightning Relic, and every time this procs, it will choose one at random. Whenever it chooses one that you already have, it just refreshes the duration of that Elemental Relic, and they provide a very, very strong buff to you based on their type, and it's the auras there. So you gain Anger, Hatred, and Wrath from each of the respective Elemental Relics, and each of these auras are the equivalent of level 27.5. So that's a huge amount of damage. You can see here you get 182 to 259 flat added fire damage to attacks and spells, 29% of physical damage as extra cold damage, and 26 to 415 added lightning damage to attacks and 23% more lightning spell damage. So these 3 are really strong buffs. Important to note there is that they only last 5 seconds, so you're going to want to play a build that can hit fairly quickly to be able to actually have all 3 of these up all the time. But that is quite a strong buff to get there, and that's going to be really nice in particular. Just having these 2 nodes and this one here, already sizing up for a build that you can use kind of elemental attacks, maybe elemental slams, something like that where you can benefit from these 3 nodes. That's quite strong. And it means that you're gaining a bunch of your damage from those auras, and importantly, you're not actually reserving that mana to gain those auras. Now, speaking of mana being reserved, we have this branch down here, which is providing level 30 Discipline, Determination, and Grace. You have to choose one of these. So Discipline is still going to reserve 35% of your mana, and you can actually see right here, going from a level 20 Discipline, which provides 217 flat energy shield, up to level 30, which is 314. This is probably the most notable skill here in terms of the amount of gem levels that you get and what it provides. But remember, this is a Duelist. And then we have level 30 Determination there, which goes from 49% more armor and 1,000 flat armor at level 20, up to 54% and 1,600 flat armor at level 30. So a decent increase to the flat armor there and 5% more armor on top. There's also Grace there, which is going from 29% more evasion and 1,500 evasion rating, up to 34% more evasion and 2,500. So you do get an extra 1,000 flat evasion there and 5% more based on those gem levels, but I'm not convinced that node is that powerful. Now, there is another single branch here coming off, which is Anointed Champion. You have Consecrated Ground around you while stationary, and effects of Consecrated Ground on you linger for 4 seconds. Consecrated Ground is actually a really strong buff. It provides 5% maximum life regen per second while you're actually standing on it, and 50% reduced effects of curses on you. You can actually scale it up a little bit as well. For example, over here we have this Devotion node here, which provides a bit of an increase there to the effect of Consecrated Ground that you create. This is going to linger on you, so even when you're moving, as long as you stop every 4 seconds to cast a skill or do something like that, you are going to basically have this Consecrated Ground buff all the time, which is really, really nice. And that's going to be kind of a nice thing to take, I think. However, if you're going for that setup which I described earlier, where you take this Warcry node in addition to both of these and go for like an elemental attack build, one node that you may want to take is Field Medicine, which gets quite strong later on. So Field Medicine, magic utility flasks applied to you have 40% increased effect, and non-unique utility flasks you use apply to linked targets. So this is 2 separate modifiers here. Importantly, that second one doesn't prevent the flask from being applied to yourself. That's actually a modifier that comes from this unique belt here. That's the exact same wording, and you can see here that it also applies to linked targets. So the flasks still affect you, but the important modifier there is the 40% increased effect of magic utility flasks. This opens up an option there where you can use the Traitor later on, along with some flask charge gain, to be able to keep up something like 3 elemental flasks permanently, and essentially try to push your character towards those 90% maximum elemental resists. So that's quite a powerful option that you could go for there. And I think I prefer this, especially in a late game setup once you actually have the Traitor, to something like Anointed Champion. If you're already spending your first 3 points on these, that is actually quite powerful. In terms of the rest of the Ascendancy there, it is basically just link stuff. We have curses inflicted on you instead of linked targets, and 40% increased effect of non-curse auras from skills while you have a linked target. So that's going to be basically a link setup if you're doing like a party play, or maybe even with a damageable minion. And there's also deep connections there, which is +5 to the level of all linked skills, and lose no experience when you die because a linked target died. Well, link skills are not really my thing, but there is one link there that you can gain quite a bit of benefit from scaling the gem levels, and that's Flame Link. So this provides some added damage to that link's target, and you go from 254 top end there up to 419 with those +5 gem levels, going from 20 to 25. So that is actually quite a big increase there. But overall, this Ascendancy, pretty cool, I think, for elemental attack builds, especially with that setup with the summon relics. There is one other thing you could do on this build, of course, and that's play Righteous Fire, because Light of Divinity is quite good with Righteous Fire. Bring the Battle is also quite good with Righteous Fire, and you also have Anointed Champion there, so you have a lot of regen all the time. So that is something you could look at, but overall, I feel like it's going to be a weaker version of a Chieftain RF, so I'm not really convinced with that either. Moving on now to the Aristocrat, which is another Duelist Ascendancy. This one is definitely inspired by the Gemling Legionnaire from PoE2. And this is quite an interesting Ascendancy. It's all about kind of stat stacking and gems. So once again, notice the layout of this Ascendancy. You must path through Inherited Fortune to actually go to these other nodes. And one thing that is interesting about this Ascendancy is that we're seeing this small node here grants 1 passive skill point. And I think the reason that we're actually seeing this node being shown off is because my guess is every single one of these small nodes is +1 passive skill point. Which means that a build using the Aristocrat is going to be gaining at least 9 passive skill points from the Ascendancy. That's 5 from here and 4 from the small nodes, which is quite strong. Now, once you've pathed through Inherited Fortune and got your extra passive skill points there, you can then choose to go 2 different directions on this Ascendancy. The bottom setup here is all about attribute stacking, and the top setup is much more about augmenting skill gems and support gems. Let's first discuss that top area here. So you can path up to Family Heirlooms, you gain +1 to level of all skill gems. This is not particularly notable, I would say, at +1, but it's still quite a nice node. It's going to provide a lot of damage on the skills that are scaling, flat damage on the gem. And then, coming off of that, we have 2 different options. Gem-lined cap, first of all, which is +3 to the level of all non-exceptional support gems. Now, first of all, non-exceptional, that means no Empower, no Enhance, and no Enlighten. All of those things are excluded from these +3 gem levels, as those are exceptional gems. But everything else is on the board, including Awakened gems. But I think the most notable use cases here are things like flat added damage gems, for example, added lightning damage. You can see here that it goes from 358 lightning damage top end on a level 20 gem, up to 479, that's about 33% more flat damage there, so that's quite powerful. But one other thing that you can do with the level of non-exceptional support gems there, +3 gem levels is very powerful on those support gems that kind of provide a skill-like effect. For example, Impending Doom. That provides a huge amount of damage there from +3 gem levels. For example, you go from this here, 1,600 to 2,400, all the way up to 2,400 to 3,600 just from 3 gem levels. That's about 50% more damage. So that's very, very powerful. You could also look at Corrupting Cry there, which is another support gem that kind of provides a skill-like effect. It makes linked Warcry skills apply Corrupted Blood. And you can see there, going from level 20 at 600 physical DPS per Corrupted Blood stack, it goes up to 866 DPS, so another huge increase there to the damage of that skill. Now, on the other option there, you have +15% to quality of all skill gems. So one thing to mention there is that this is skill gems, it won't apply to support gems. And to be honest with you, a lot of skill gems these days have very good quality stats. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but for example, you have things like Tectonic Slam of Cataclysm there, which is 5% more damage per endurance charge removed at 20% quality. So you're going to be able to get that up to 35% quality for a bunch of extra damage per endurance charge removed. There's also Reap, which does a similar thing there with blood charges. But there's also other options there. Things like Petrified Blood are quite interesting. So this is -5% of life loss prevented is lost over 4 seconds. So what happens with Petrified Blood is you take a hit once you're on low life there. What's going to happen is some of the damage is going to be taken immediately, and then a percentage of the damage that was prevented is lost over 4 seconds. And this skill, by default at level 20, it's already preventing some of that damage from actually being taken over time, and this quality stat actually lowers that even further. So at 20% quality, it's -5, and then obviously you're going to be able to boost that up with the extra 15% quality. There's also Energy Blade there, which is very powerful with extra quality. So this one is already 50% less maximum energy shield on the skill itself. And the quality stat is actually gaining more maximum energy shield, which is additive with this stat before it's actually applied to your character. So at 20% quality, this buff would be brought down to 45% less. And at 35% quality, which is the 20% plus the 15 from that Ascendancy, it's going to be brought down to 42% less. And that's actually so powerful in Energy Blade, because it means that not only are you going to have more defenses from having more energy shield, but you're also going to have more damage, because this damage gained here is scaled based on your energy shield. So those are quite powerful there. This is kind of an interesting option that you can go for over here. But I think that most of the Aristocrat builds that we're going to see in this league are going to be pathing down the bottom here and doing something to do with attribute stacking. You've already pathed through Inherited Fortune. You now have a 3 choice here. And essentially, each of these nodes are gaining the Cannot Be Shocked, Cannot Be Ignited, and Cannot Be Frozen modifiers from the Cyclopean Coil there. And they also have a huge amount of increased attributes. 30% increased intelligence on private tuition, 30% increased strength on illicit gains, and 30% increased dexterity there on fancy foil. One thing that you can do, of course, is take all 3 of these and do something with crystallized omniscience. That is potentially really, really powerful. That will essentially mean that you have 90% increased omniscience, and that means you can just stack omniscience like crazy. It means that you'll basically be able to immediately solve your elemental resistances and gain a huge amount of penetration there as well. So that is one option that you could look at doing. And one of the other things that I think we're going to be seeing a lot of Aristocrats doing is actually just taking one of these and focusing on it and just obviously doing a normal kind of attribute stacking build where you just focus on one attribute. So that's also something you could do. But another interesting node there is the one behind this, which is Dreadful Attitude. So this one grants some reduced attribute requirements there for items and gems, but importantly it provides 5% increased damage per 5 of your lowest attribute. Now I know that Captain Lance made a couple of tri-stack builds before, and this modifier right here at 5% increased damage is absurdly powerful. To put that into context, the Cyclopean Coil is 1% increased damage per 5 of your lowest attribute. You could actually stack this up with it as well to increase that up to 6%. But that is just going to be a crazy amount of damage. I think Lance managed to get his tri-attribute stack builds up to like 900 of each attribute or something like that. So you can see that's going to be a huge amount of increased damage. But one thing that's notable about this node here is that you cannot take Dreadful Attitude and also take all 3 of these attribute increasing nodes, because that would be too many ascendancy points. So you have to make a choice here in terms of which nodes you go for to actually get to Dreadful Attitude. And that means that at least one of the attributes is going to have a bit less of an increase there, and you're going to have to make up for that increase in another way on your gear to be able to kind of make that tri-attribute stack build actually work. Overall, that's some more fun ascendancies there. I actually really do like the Herald ascendancy in particular. I think it's really, really cool, especially with the Calamitous Visions unique jewel there. A lot of interesting things you can do there in terms of Autobombers, and especially Herald of Agony, which I think is an extremely unpopular skill, but one that is going to deal a lot of damage in this build. What do you guys think of these ascendancies? Let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.